The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly in the nearly empty courthouse lobby. Judge Naomi Grant adjusted the strap of her leather briefcase, her every step purposeful. Today was no ordinary day. It was sentencing day for a high-profile case she presided over, a case that had garnered national attention due to its controversial elements. As Naomi approached the security checkpoint, she noticed Officer Raymond Carter, a smug, broad-shouldered man leaning against the metal detector. His blue uniform was crisp, and his light blue eyes followed her every move with a disapproving glare. Naomi had crossed paths with Carter before, and each interaction left her with an unsettling feeling of condescension. Today, however, his demeanor seemed even more off-putting. "ID," Carter barked, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. Naomi raised an eyebrow but didn't falter. "Good morning to you too, Officer Carter," she replied, reaching into her bag to produce her government-issued badge. Carter snatched the badge and inspected it as though it were counterfeit. He scoffed. "Judge. Huh." His lips curled into a smirk. "You don't look like a judge." The air grew still as Naomi's gaze locked onto his. "And what exactly does a judge look like, officer?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with undeniable authority. Carter ignored her question, his smirk widening. "Step aside. I need to run a secondary check on you." Naomi's expression didn't waver, but the tension was palpable. The other officers behind Carter exchanged uneasy glances, oblivious or unbothered. Carter gestured impatiently toward a side area. This wasn't the first time Naomi had encountered prejudice, but as she stepped aside, her mind began to calculate. Years of legal training were already formulating a strategy. Something told her this moment would require more than patience. It would demand brilliance. Naomi complied with Carter's demand, stepping into the side screening area with her head held high. Her heels clicked against the tiled floor, each sound a reminder of her authority, a stark contrast to Carter's treatment of her. Carter followed, standing just a little too close. He crossed his arms, looking down at her with the same condescending smirk. "You know, we get a lot of people who claim to be someone important," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "You can't trust everything you see on a badge." Naomi tilted her head slightly, studying him. "And what would you suggest I do to prove myself, Officer Carter?" "Wear a robe and carry a gavel at all times." Carter chuckled, the sound hollow and patronizing. "Funny, but no, Judge. I think you'll need to answer a few questions." "Questions?" Naomi asked, her voice as steady as a metronome. "On what grounds?" Carter shrugged, his smirk never leaving. "Just procedure. You don't seem like the type who would understand the gravity of the law. You're what, early 40s? Got lucky? Pulled a few strings?" The insinuation was clear. Naomi felt a flicker of anger, but didn't let it show. She'd faced worse. Instead, she allowed a small, composed smile to cross her face. "I see. So my years of legal education, my tenure on the bench, and the rulings I've made in high-stakes cases mean nothing because you've decided to act as the arbiter of legitimacy today?" Carter leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Listen, lady, I don't make the rules. I just enforce them. You want to keep arguing, or do you want to get this over with?" The other officers in the area remained silent, their eyes flicking back and forth between Carter and Naomi, unsure whether to intervene or let the tension play out. Naomi reached into her bag and produced her ID again, her movements deliberate. "Here's what's going to happen, Officer Carter," she said. "You're going to scan my badge, verify it, and let me through. Then you can return to your actual job instead of singling me out for reasons you and I both know have nothing to do with security." Carter blinked, momentarily thrown off by her confidence, but the smirk quickly returned. "We'll see about that." He snatched her badge again, holding it up to the light as though searching for flaws. Naomi remained still, her calm demeanor masking the fire building within her. Carter was trying to assert dominance, to provoke her into losing her composure. But Naomi was no ordinary woman, and Carter was about to learn that the hard way. Carter took his time, deliberately dragging out the inspection of Naomi's badge. He flipped it over, squinting at the back as though searching for something incriminating. His performance was transparent, an attempt to make her feel small under his authority. Humph, he muttered, shaking his head. Doesn't look official to me. You sure you didn't pick this up online? Naomi raised an eyebrow, her calm gaze piercing through him. Perhaps if you spent more time familiarizing yourself with government credentials and less time antagonizing citizens, you'd recognize an official badge when you see one. A few of the nearby officers stifled smirks, clearly uncomfortable with Carter's antics but unwilling to challenge him outright. Carter, however, wasn't amused. He stepped closer, his tone dropping to a patronizing sneer. "You've got a smart mouth for someone standing in my courthouse," he said. Naomi's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Your courthouse? Last I checked, this building belongs to the taxpayers, and I happen to be one of them." Carter's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked as though he might snap. Instead, he reached for his radio, clicking it on with exaggerated movements. "I'm going to need verification on a questionable ID," he announced loudly, his words echoing through the quiet lobby. The tension in the room thickened as the other officers exchanged uneasy glances. Naomi, however, remained perfectly composed. She adjusted her posture, standing taller, her commanding presence filling the space. "Questionable ID," she repeated, her voice calm but cutting. "Officer Carter, do you honestly believe this performance is going unnoticed?" Carter's smirk faltered but quickly recovered. "Just following protocol, ma'am." Naomi let the silence stretch, her gaze never leaving Carter. The other officers began to shift uncomfortably, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Finally, Naomi spoke, her tone as sharp as a scalpel. "If your protocol includes harassing officers of the court, perhaps you should consider reviewing it. Or better yet, I'll review it for you when I'm back on the bench." The subtle but unmistakable threat in her words made Carter's smirk falter again. For the first time, he seemed to realize that he might have underestimated the woman standing before him. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, leaning closer with an air of false confidence. "You don't intimidate me," he said, his voice low. Naomi's smile widened, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was the smile of someone who had already won a game her opponent didn't even realize they were playing. "Good," she replied, "because this isn't about intimidation. It's about accountability." Naomi shifted her weight slightly, her gaze never leaving Carter. "While we wait for your so-called verification," she continued, "let's discuss this interaction. You've detained me without cause, subjected me to unnecessary scrutiny, and implied, quite directly, that I don't belong in my position. Shall we continue?" Carter stiffened, his smirk fading slightly. The tension in the room was palpable, the eyes of his colleagues darting nervously between him and Naomi. For the first time, Carter seemed unsure of himself. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered, his voice defensive. "And I'm doing mine." Naomi countered smoothly. "Although it's interesting that your version of just doing your job involves singling out individuals who don't fit your narrow expectations of authority." Carter flushed slightly but stood his ground. "Listen, lady. Judge Grant," Naomi corrected, her voice firm. "Judge Grant," Carter said through gritted teeth. "You can keep talking, but it doesn't change the fact that I call the shots here." Naomi allowed a brief silence to hang in the air, studying Carter like a seasoned chess player analyzing her opponent's next move. "If you're so sure of your authority, why not escalate this further? Call your supervisor," she suggested, her tone calm but edged with challenge. Carter hesitated, the confidence in his smirk waning. The suggestion of involving his superior introduced an element of risk he hadn't anticipated. "Not necessary," he replied quickly. "I've got this under control." "Oh, I'm sure you do, Officer Carter," Naomi said, her faint smile returning. "But here's the thing. You've crossed the line from control into abuse of authority, and I'm certain your supervisors will be just as interested in this interaction as I am." Carter opened his mouth to respond, but Naomi reached into her briefcase and pulled out a sleek recording device. She pressed a button, and a faint beep sounded, followed by a robotic voice announcing, "Recording started." The other officers froze, their eyes widening. Carter's face turned pale, Naomi held up the device, her expression calm but unyielding. I've learned to document interactions like these for accountability, she said. Now, why don't we review this recording together and determine whether your behavior aligns with department policy? The smug confidence drained from Carter's face, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. The realization dawned on him that he might have underestimated her. Naomi wasn't done yet. Let's clarify what's transpired here. Naomi continued, her voice smooth but unrelenting. You've detained me without cause, attempted to demean my credentials, and demonstrated clear bias in your actions. This isn't about security, it's about prejudice. Carter's colleagues exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of Naomi's words settling over the room. One officer, an older man with a worn badge suggesting decades of service, finally stepped forward. Judge Grant, he said, his voice careful, is there something I can assist you with? Naomi turned her attention to the older officer, her expression softening slightly. Yes, actually, could you confirm whether this extended inspection is standard procedure for members of the judiciary entering this courthouse? The officer hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to his colleague and the undeniable truth of the situation. No, ma'am, he admitted finally. It's not. Carter shot the older officer a glare, but the damage was done. Naomi's faint smile returned, though it didn't reach her eyes. Thank you for clarifying, she said. Now, Officer Carter, I believe you owe me an apology. Carter's lips tightened into a thin line. He looked as though the words physically hurt him, but under the weight of the moment and the watchful eyes of his colleagues, he relented. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Louder, please, Naomi said. I want everyone here to hear it. Carter's cheeks flushed deeper, and he clenched his fists at his sides. I'm sorry, he repeated louder this time. Apology accepted, Naomi said coolly, slipping her badge back into her briefcase. But this isn't over. Your actions today are a glaring example of the issues we strive to eliminate in public service: bias, discrimination, and abuse of authority. Carter opened his mouth to retort, but the older officer placed a firm hand on his shoulder. That's enough. Carter, step back, the older officer said firmly. Carter's shoulders sagged, and he stepped away, his expression a mix of anger and humiliation. Naomi adjusted the strap of her briefcase and turned toward the security checkpoint. Let's ensure this incident is properly documented, she said to the older officer. Yes, ma'am, he replied, his tone respectful. I'll see to it personally. Naomi nodded, her commanding presence unshaken. I'll be following up to ensure that it is, she said before walking through the checkpoint with her head held high. As Naomi entered the courtroom, the incident lingered in her mind. This wasn't just about her. It was about challenging a system that allowed bias to fester unchecked. Carter had learned a lesson that day, but Naomi knew her work was far from over. For every Carter, there were countless others who needed to be held accountable, and Naomi was ready to continue the fight. One case, one encounter, and one act of resilience at a time.